It's been a tough triple header for Mercedes, as the team tried to bounce back from two challenging races in a row in Azerbaijan and Monaco. But it wasn't to be, as Max Verstappen and Red Bull won all three races in the triple header and took both championships by the scruff of the neck. So is this World Championship slipping away from Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Coming into the last few races, the sentiment among the F1 media was that Mercedes would be the fastest in France, as it's a track that would suit their car. But in the end, it was Max Verstappen that won that race in what has turned out to be a pivotal moment in this World Championship fight. In this video, I'll look back on the championship so far and assess whether the championship fight is slipping away from Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton as we get towards the summer break, and whether they'll be able to catch up to the Red Bull car ahead of them, or if Mercedes will need to wait for 2022 to have another chance at championship glory. And as always, if you enjoy the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Behind the Drive if you're new around here. The 2021 season. Looking all the way back to testing, it seemed like for the first time in the turbo hybrid era, Mercedes wouldn't have the fastest car on the grid. The team looked off the boil, and whilst they often hide their true pace in testing, there were all sorts of signs that things weren't quite right, from the team not running their car as soon as possible after the lunch breaks, to the drivers having unusual offs in the car that looked like quite a lot to handle. And the truth came out at the first race weekend in Bahrain after qualifying, as it was Max Verstappen and Red Bull that put his car on pole position by almost 0.3 of a second from Lewis Hamilton. It was the first competitive running we'd seen this season, and it wasn't good news for Mercedes. In the end, the Silver Arrows came out on top after a close battle in the desert, but there was no hiding the fact that they didn't have the strongest car in 2021. Moving on to the second race at Imola, the Mercedes car looked slightly better than the first race in qualifying, as Hamilton took pole by around 0.03 of a second from Sergio Perez. But that race didn't go to plan, as Hamilton lost out to Verstappen at turn 3 in the wet conditions. But, despite other mistakes in the race, Hamilton managed to come back to finish second. So again, a race that really raised more questions for Mercedes than answers. Then came two races in Portugal and Spain, where Mercedes took pole position and the win on both occasions. The team's challenges from the first couple of races looked to be behind them, as Lewis Hamilton grew a 14-point lead in the World Drivers' Championship over Max Verstappen, and Mercedes built a 29-point lead in the Constructors' Championship. So at this early stage in the season, all things were positive for Mercedes. They had overcome their testing challenges and had tamed what looked like a challenging car to drive. Recovering quickly from setbacks has always been the way of that team, and what we've all grown accustomed to over the last 7 years of Mercedes' dominance. They find a way to improve and adapt whenever a challenge presents itself to them. But the following race was at Monaco, on a track that, on paper at least, would favour the Red Bull philosophy over the Mercedes car. But I don't think anyone expected the Mercedes team to be that far behind, particularly in the hands of Lewis Hamilton. It seems like they had found themselves chasing the setup when things weren't going to plan. After qualifying, where Hamilton ended up 7th on the grid, he stated to the media that he planned to have tough discussions with the team's engineers after his pace was better on the Thursday practice sessions than it was on Saturday. He mentioned the fact that the team had even made setup changes between FP3 and qualifying, which shows the fact that the team were not confident in finding the right setup on their car for that circuit. And when you consider the fact that qualifying is crucial around the streets of Monaco, where the driver needs to have absolute trust in their car in order to get the absolute maximum from their Q3 lap, this is perhaps the worst place the world champions could have been. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen managed to put himself second on the grid, which then became an effective pole position after Charles Leclerc failed to make it to the starting grid. And at that same time, Lewis Hamilton's teammate, Valtteri Bottas, was capable of putting the same car on third position on the grid. So whilst it looked pretty bad for Hamilton, it wasn't all bad for Mercedes as a team. That is, of course, until race day. During that race, all was going well, considering qualifying positions of the team's drivers. But ultimately, a pit stop wheel gun issue caused Bottas to retire from second place, and strategic errors resulted in Hamilton losing out on positions and ending up 7th, having technically started 6th. A poor showing from the Mercedes outfit, but ultimately there was no need to be alarmed, as Monaco wasn't a circuit that the team were expecting to be at their best. Moving on to Baku, and once again, Mercedes were on the back foot, although it was the opposite to Monaco in the sense that it was Lewis Hamilton leading the way, with Valtteri Bottas struggling that weekend. This track was host to a critical mistake for Hamilton and the Mercedes team in general, as Lewis Hamilton turned on the brake magic function on the restart of the race, which cost him what would have been a race victory that afternoon and left him and the team with 0 points from that weekend. So the Mercedes team had collected just 7 points from these 2 race weekends, whilst their title challengers Red Bull had scored 62, which meant that Mercedes had gone from a 29-point lead to a 26-point deficit in the Constructors' Championship. And that brings us up to the first triple header of the season, and a return to Paul Ricard for the French Grand Prix. The predictions in advance of this race were that this would represent a return to the types of circuit that the Mercedes car would come out on top, much like Spain and Portugal, and it was certainly closer between the 2 leading teams. But in the end, it was Red Bull and Max Verstappen that made the right strategy call to come back and win that Grand Prix. And now we've arrived at the last 2 races, both hosted at the Red Bull Ring in Austria. And on this occasion, it was the Red Bull car that was in a league of its own, particularly in the hands of Max Verstappen, while Mercedes faltered once again, and even had to try a different setup at the second running of the race to try and find a way to recoup some of that time gap between the 2 teams. So after all this, Mercedes' deficit to Red Bull has widened further to 44 points in the Constructors' Championship at the end of this triple header. Not insurmountable by any means, but certainly one of the biggest gaps in the Constructors' Championship that the team have faced in the turbo hybrid era. 2022 focus. The title challenge for Mercedes couldn't have come at a worse time. The current aerodynamic regulations come to an end this season as Formula 1 enters a new era for 2022. This change requires the focus of the team's world-class aerodynamicists and engineers to design and build the best challenger possible for these new rules. This aerodynamic challenge is coupled with the first ever financial regulations in the sport. All Formula 1 teams are restricted in their spending for the first time, which has caused all manner of issues for the biggest teams in the sport. This isn't the first time that these 2 teams have battled it out between regulation changes. Back in 2013, Red Bull were on track to win their 4th double world championship in a row, and in that year, Mercedes were a team on the rise, as they won 3 of the races in the first half of that season. Lewis Hamilton's win in Hungary just before the summer break set alarm bells ringing at the Red Bull factory, as they were worried that this Mercedes team could well have a car that would be capable of beating them going into the second half of the year, and as a result, Red Bull chose to continue their development of that car, which will have inevitably cost their development focus on the 2014 car. Meanwhile, Mercedes stopped all development on their 2013 Challenger before the summer break, as they knew the importance of the new regulations on the horizon. They instead switched their focus to the 2014 car, and well, we all know what happened next as the team won 7 double world championships in a row. As for Red Bull, well, the championship victor Sebastian Vettel went on to win every single race in the second half of the 2013 season, and comfortably won the world championship in his potentially overdeveloped car. As a result, they ended up on the back foot for 2014. The 2021 season has a huge number of parallels to that time, and again, it could well be Red Bull that end up winning this season's championship, whilst putting themselves at a disadvantage in the future. But this year, the spotlight on the switch in development focus has been exacerbated by the fact that the teams are facing a $145 million budget cap in 2021. For most teams, this isn't so much of a challenge given they don't spend that kind of money anyway. But for Mercedes and Red Bull, this is a significant restriction on what they can spend on car development, making the change in development focus such a critical moment for these teams. Following the 2 tough weekends in Monaco and Azerbaijan, Toto Wolff remained adamant that the team's focus had switched to 2022, and that it wouldn't be possible to change their focus back to 2021 now they'd made this call. Yet after the Styrian Grand Prix, Mercedes technical director James Allison announced that there were still new parts on the way for the Mercedes W12, which are expected to arrive at the next race at Silverstone. Plus, power unit improvements will be expected throughout the rest of the season, given those regulations aren't changing for next season. Red Bull, on the other hand, has a different approach, as Verstappen has openly said that the team must not risk making a similar error to BMW Sauber in 2008. where they switched their focus to the new regulations when they had a car that had the potential to win that World Championship. The team ended up missing out on the 2008 championship, and their 2009 challenger with the new regulations was uncompetitive. The Red Bull team, therefore, are continuing to bring new parts to this year's car, which is perhaps one of the reasons why they've started to build such a large lead in the Constructors' Championship, and Verstappen's building a strong lead in the Drivers' Championship. Much like Mercedes, Honda is throwing everything at improving their power unit alongside this, as they look to leave the sport on a high. So even if there are aerodynamic developments on the Mercedes car at Silverstone, and they find themselves back on the pace of the Red Bull team, the challenge will continue, as it seems like the Red Bull car will continue to be developed throughout the rest of this year. The focus of Mercedes being on 2022 shows how they're in the sport for the long haul, and they want success beyond this year as well. But as we've seen from BMW Sauber in 2008, there are risks with this approach as well. Is the championship slipping away from Mercedes? So we've looked at what's happened so far, and that the Mercedes focus is on next year already, but can we really count them out? Well, I think that no matter what, the championship will end up being close. The two teams are well matched right now, and the cost cap will probably force Red Bull to focus solely on 2022 sooner than they otherwise might have done. The other factor to consider is Lewis Hamilton, who's been critical to the Mercedes' success whenever they've faced challenges from other teams over the last few years. He has the experience of coming back to win championships from behind, and has more experience than anyone on the grid right now at winning Formula 1 World Championships. So even if he doesn't have the best car, if there is anyone that can win races for the Silver Arrows, it would be him. But to counter that point at the same time, you must also consider how bulletproof Max Verstappen has been this season. He's been one of, if not the best driver this year, which is proven by the fact that at every race that he's finished, he's come either first or second. So far his form is class, but at 23 years old, you have to ask the question over how he will handle what will be his first championship battle running. Both of these are somewhat carrying their teams right now, so the other point to consider from the Constructors' Championship perspective is the battle of the number 2s, as both Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas have had some performances this year that they'd probably rather forget. So it'll be all about whether they can pick up their consistency and be on the third step of the podium more regularly in the latter stages of this season. This will make a huge difference for their team in the Constructors' Championship, and also tactically support their teammate out at the front. So their performance this season is critical in this championship fight. As for my opinion, well, if Red Bull continue developing this car, then it's difficult not to expect both them and Verstappen to be lifting the World Championship trophy coming the end of this season. They're already out on top, so it would be tough to see how Mercedes could come back. But at the same time, it's always a risk betting against Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton in particular, as on their day, they are the very best that this sport has to offer. What do you think? Who's the World Championship favourite? Make sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this video and watched this far, then be sure to leave it a like and hit the subscribe button for more videos like this one in the future.